Parce que si la Russie venait à gagner, la vie des Français changerait. Si la Russie gagne cette guerre, la crédibilité de l'Europe sera réduite à zéro.
Throughout the 2 years of war in Ukraine, few things seem as intense as the turnaround by French President Emmanuel Macron. From a stance of let's not humiliate Russia and handing out carrots to Moscow by way of let's negotiate and get along, we've switched to a menu that is, let's just say, a little more spicy.
Emmanuel Macron calls for an effort to ensure the defeat of Russia. At a meeting of Ukraine's allies on Monday in Paris, the French president announced new measures to supply more weapons to Kiev and spoke of the hypothesis of a dispatch of Western troops in the future.
Il n'y a pas de consensus aujourd'hui pour envoyer de manière officielle, assumée et endossée des troupes au sol. Mais en dynamique, rien ne doit être exclu.
Indeed, Macron has not only suggested that NATO needs to consider sending troops to Ukraine, but has set out the situations in which France itself would do so. As reported by the French daily L'Indépendant, Macron has met with the rest of France's parliamentary forces and told them that he is ready to jump in and send troops to Ukraine if the Russian military manages to score any goals. In other words, if they advance towards strategic cities such as Odessa or Kyiv. Macron has even gone so far as to ask the rest of the European countries not to be cowards. But what could explain such a U-turn? Why is Macron now saying that France could go so far as to send soldiers to Ukraine? I'm sure that in the last few weeks, many of you have asked yourselves a similar question. What the hell is going on? Well, that's what we at VisualPolitik are here for, so let's get into it. VisualPolitik community, it is said that during an event in Paris, held on 21st of February at the Pantheon of the Illustrious, Macron told a group of guests, and I quote literally, "Next year, I'm going to have to send some guys to Odessa." Just 5 days later, on 26th of February, the French president said publicly that it could not be ruled out that NATO may have to intervene directly in Ukraine.
Many people who say never, never today were the same people who said never tanks, never planes, never long-range missiles.
Of course, these words generated a huge political storm at home. A storm with thunder and lightning, but with a lot of criticism.
Emmanuel Macron plays warlord, but it is our children's lives he's talking about so carelessly.
And not only at home, but also from abroad.
Germany rebuffs Emmanuel Macron on troops for Ukraine and tells Paris to supply more weapons.
However, far from backing down, Macron has continued to push in the same vein. For example, in an interview on French television on 14th of March, the French president was very, very clear.
If the situation worsens, we must be ready, and we will be ready. There is an escalation by Russia, and we have to say that we are ready to respond.
In this way, Macron is becoming one of Ukraine's staunchest allies. At the same time, in Washington, the Republicans are blocking funding, and in Europe, many governments are still not getting their act together. Macron has promised to work for unlimited support for Kyiv. In this vein, France has committed more than 3 billion euros in direct military aid to Ukraine in 2024 alone. This will be the year in which France will donate the most military resources. By the way, if we take into account that the US economy is almost 8 times the size of France's, this would amount to an outlay of about $24 billion by Washington. And that's not counting European Union funding. Remember, we are talking about just one country. I'm saying this for all those who say that Europe is taking advantage of the United States in the matter of Ukraine. But let's not get bogged down. That's another story. The fact is that, naturally, Russia has reacted to all these moves from the Elysee Palace. On 12th of February, Paris made public the existence of a Russian digital network, the one known as Portal Combat, which had the mission to flood French social media with false information about the Ukrainian war. And that is not evidently all. Putin himself has once again dusted off his worn-out book of threats.
Russia prepared for nuclear war, warns Vladimir Putin.
Then we are also seeing other warnings, such as cyber attacks, and even direct threats. In some cases, very direct threats. For example, on 22nd of February, a Russian air traffic control system threatened to shoot down French reconnaissance planes operating over the Black Sea. So that was a pretty clear warning. And make no mistake, Macron's swerve was no small thing. For a long time, it was the French president who had the best connection and understanding with Putin. In fact, it was he who played a leading role as mediator before and during the first months of the invasion of Ukraine. During that time, the Frenchman believed that he could convince the Russian president to reach a solution. Even he believed he could persuade him to give up trying to win the war. Paris's confidence was such that, for a long time, they did not take particularly seriously the possibility that the war could be prolonged. In fact, the French government blocked the use of European Union funds to buy artillery munitions outside the community bloc for months, basically because they did not think it was something that essential, and because, according to them, such expenditure would not serve to boost the European defense industry. And they certainly didn't go all out with the delivery of military equipment either. For example, taking the French government's own published data, between 2022 and 2023, this country gave Ukraine 3.8 billion euros in military assistance. This is far below the more than 17 billion given by Germany, or the more than 9 billion given by the United Kingdom in the same period. In other words, for a long time, the leaders in Paris were convinced that the war would end sooner rather than later, with the reissuance of some sort of updated Minsk pacts. But VisualPolitik community, now all that has changed.
Macron realized that Putin had deceived him personally. It took some time, but the result is there.
Eventually, the French president realized that this whole plan to negotiate with the Kremlin for a ceasefire right off the bat was totally unfeasible. In fact, even back in September 2022, Macron had to give up his role as mediator as futile. It was at that moment that the French president began to be convinced that trying to negotiate with Putin without a wild card was a waste of time. But now, Macron seems to have become convinced of something even more important. Either a change of game plan is achieved, or the conflict could escalate.
Si la Russie gagne cette guerre, la crédibilité de l'Europe sera réduite à zéro.
Let me explain. The problem is that Putin is completely locked into a war logic, and unless he manages to increase the pressure sufficiently, the war in Ukraine may never end. Or worse, it may end up with an attack on NATO's own territory, as we told you in a previous video. This is not just us speculating, it is something that Macron himself says.
If we let Ukraine lose this war, then Russia will surely threaten Moldova, Romania, Poland.
And at this point, let me tell you something. Based on your comments, in a recent video in which we told you what a Russian attack on NATO might look like, many of you seem to think this whole possibility is a completely far-fetched idea. Nevertheless, I'm sorry to tell you that the governments of Norway, Sweden, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Denmark, and Poland think very differently. So do many senior German officials, and by the looks of it, now Macron does too. If Putin is not stopped, this could end with the worst imaginable scenario, a war on NATO soil. This is exactly what intelligence sources say. For example, Estonian intelligence chiefs, who are well known for following very closely what is happening in Russia, and these days, particularly in Ukraine, have raised the alert. The Kremlin is restructuring and expanding the country's military in anticipation of a conflict with NATO sometime in the next 10 years. But why would Putin do that? Well, you see, here on VisualPolitik, we have already told you about it. Because an attack on NATO territory and a conventional warfare response could be the Kremlin's masterstroke for accomplishing its goals, including the capture of Ukraine. I'll leave you the video link with all the information in the description. That said, the question is Russia actually preparing for such a scenario? Could that be what Macron is worrying about? What exactly does the French president mean by sending troops to Ukraine? Well, let's take a look.
The latest escalation.
VisualPolitik community, if the Ukrainian war has made one thing clear to us, it is that the Russian army was a real disaster. However, when a large-scale war is fought, two things happen. On the one hand, the army gains experience. On the other hand, errors and weaknesses are identified. Well, that is exactly what the Russians are working with right now. The Russian government is restructuring the entire chain of command, and also the armed forces' own internal organization. For example, they are dissolving the Joint Strategic Commands to return to a structure based clearly on military branches. Thus, the Pacific, Black Sea, and Baltic fleets have been placed under the direct command of the Navy, and exactly the same has happened with the Air Force. Leningrad and Moscow military districts were also re-established at the beginning of 2024. In other words, the Kremlin has set about reforming its armed forces from top to bottom, all with one premise: to return to a much more military-intensive and NATO border-centric military concept. In In fact, the armed forces are expanding to add 400,000 new troops to reach 1.5 million by 2026. In other words, Russia is working intensively to expand the size of its armed forces at full speed, not only in the immediate future, but above all, structurally. It is a radical change of trend, and the question is, for what? Well, take a wild guess. But bear in mind that this is the opinion of the Estonian intelligence service.
NATO could face a massive Soviet-style army in the next decade. This army is likely to be technologically inferior to NATO allies' defense forces in most areas. However, its military potential would be significant due to its size, firepower, combat experience, and reserves.
And that's not all. On top of that, Russia is gradually developing a war economy. More than a third of all public spending is already devoted to military spending, and arms manufacturers are starting to work around the clock. Want a concrete example? Just take a look at the preparation of artillery shells. I am sorry to say it, but at the moment, war is Vladimir Putin's only priority. And given that he's going to have a country in a war economy and a much larger military, that could end up leading to, as we previously said, an attack on NATO soil. It would be something like the perfect pressure move. And obviously that is a serious concern for NATO. Perhaps now you understand better why Macron seems to be pouring so much gasoline on the fire, because he's saying that we need to get our act together urgently, because he claims that the defeat of Ukraine would put an end to security in Europe. Now, if troops were sent, what exactly would we be talking about? Well, let's see. The first thing we have to be clear about is that when Macron talks about sending troops, he doesn't mean sending large contingents of thousands or hundreds of thousands of men to fight in Ukraine. That is not, at least for now, under discussion. At present, the suggested troop deployment consists of the following. On the one hand, to demonstrate support for Ukraine and to make it clear to Russia that in this war they won't have much more to gain because they won't succeed in turning the Ukrainian state into a puppet of Moscow. Let's just say that in this vein, the presence of NATO soldiers, or the possibility of intervention, would set a very clear limit. And of course, it would be a boost of optimism for the Ukrainians and a reality check for Moscow. Something like Mario Draghi's famous whatever it takes during the Euro crisis in 2015, but in a foreign policy version. This would be the first goal. Naturally, there is also a second, let's say much more operational objective. You see, one of the problems Ukraine has had in recent months has had a lot to do with the management of the weaponry and military equipment delivered, and also the lack of training. Well, along these lines, the presence of NATO troops would have this objective. First, to have the training of the troops take place in Ukraine itself. This would allow for longer and more consistent training. And second, to provide specialists to contribute to complex tasks. We're talking about tasks such as missile management, air force maintenance, operating electronic warfare systems, and other advanced military equipment, selecting targets, preparing for special operations, conducting cyber warfare, and so on and so forth.
Au-delà, nous devons envisager de nouvelles actions de soutien à l'Ukraine. Celles-ci doivent répondre à des besoins très précis. Je pense notamment au déminage, au cyber, à la production d'armes sur place, sur le territoire ukrainien. Et certaines de ces actions pourraient nécessiter une présence sur le territoire ukrainien sans franchir le seuil de belligérance. Rien ne doit être exclu.
Of course, this would be a major escalation and certainly makes one thing quite clear. The French government considers that certain red lines are being crossed and that the danger, far from being reduced, is increasing. Not surprisingly, Europe is far from being unanimous about the possibility of sending military troops to Ukraine. The German government, or rather Chancellor Scholz, is strongly opposed to it. In fact, the argument Scholz is giving for denying the delivery of the Taurus long-range missiles requested by Kyiv is precisely that, for their proper use, they would have to be operated by German soldiers inside or outside Ukraine, and that, as Chancellor of Germany, that is a red line he is under no circumstances willing to cross. By the way, as a side note, the Taurus is a long-range strike missile that is fired from a fighter aircraft and is ideally suited to destroying robust structures, such as bridges or bunkers. This is because its main explosive warhead explodes not on impact, but after it's already penetrated several layers of material. In other words, it is launched, impacts, the missile penetrates the structure, and then explodes. What's more, it also has a longer range than the British Storm Shadow or the French Scalp, and is also extremely stealthy. That is why it is so coveted by the Ukrainians, but it looks like they're going to be left wanting. The point is that, on top of the opposition of many of its European Union partners, France has another problem. Unlike Draghi, France lacks the means to do whatever it takes to protect Ukraine. It is the only nuclear-armed country in the EU, but has an average military and stressed public finances. Even so, Macron is following two additional paths to those we have seen. He has led the signing of a security agreement with Ukraine, which was ratified on 12th of March by the French Assembly by an overwhelming majority. Besides that, he is pushing for increased production of ammunition and military equipment throughout Europe. Along these lines, he has endorsed the proposal of the Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas that the European Union should issue bonds and use them to finance defensive investments in member countries. Remember the Taurus missiles we spoke about a moment ago? Well, their production has been halted since 2019. A disaster, and that is something that Macron now wants to change. The idea is that the European military industry gets its act together, as for example, Rheinmetall, the large German manufacturer of military equipment that is promoting 4 new weapons factories in Ukraine, is starting to do. At this point in time, it has already secured an agreement with Germany and Poland to increase military production and arms deliveries to Ukraine.
Scholz, Macron, and Tusk agreed to speed up arms purchases for Ukraine on the entire global market.
But now that we know what ideas Macron has and why he says what he says, the question is over to you. And today the question could not be clearer. What do you think of the role that the French president has taken in recent months? Do you agree or disagree with his position? How far do you think this new momentum in France will go? Leave us your thoughts down in the comments. I'm sure the debate is going to be hotter than the European Champions Final. And of course, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe to VisualPolitik. Thank you so very much for watching, all the best, and I'll see you next time.